mechanisms of regulating, we're going to speak about active hyperemia, and this is basically increasing blood flow in response to increased metabolic activity. So when the body is in steady state, or when an organ system is in steady state, there is a constant amount of oxygen that's coming in, and it is exactly matching the amount of oxygen that is being consumed. So there isn't an excess oxygen building up. So as oxygen is coming in, it's being used, and then carbon dioxide is going to be the same. So the amount of carbon dioxide that's being produced from the tissue will match the amount of carbon dioxide that's leaving. If we increase metabolic rate, which are the factors we talked about in the previous slide, we're going to need more oxygen. So oxygen is being consumed faster than it can be delivered, and so we're going to need to vasodilate those tissues. Likewise for carbon dioxide, it's going to start building up at that local site, in that local tissue, and we're going to need to increase flow to get rid of it. So that's going to bring about vasodilation, which will increase blood flow, will bring in fresh oxygen, and will remove that carbon dioxide. All right, and this slide pretty much highlights that very same phenomenon. So we have blood flow, we have the arteriole, and we have the capillary bed to a specific tissue. And under normal steady state circumstances, we can see the blue dots are pretty much matching the green dots. So that's carbon dioxide delivery, or carbon dioxide removal, and oxygen delivery. And that is being matched pretty much for the most part. If we increase our metabolic rate, so let's say these tissues are under high, question? Nope. Okay. So let's say these tissues are under high metabolic demand, they're going to start producing more carbon dioxide than the amount of oxygen that's coming in, right? And so what we have is a mismatch of the carbon dioxide and oxygen. We can see the green dots start building up here more, and that is an indicator to increase the size of the radius of these arterioles, which is brought about by vasodilation. That brings more oxygen in, and then as we can see here, we can match the oxygen consumption and the carbon dioxide removal once again. Just to remind ourselves, just to have a bit of a review here, what is the function of oxygen as it comes into the tissues? Where is it going? When we deliver oxygen to cells, where exactly are they going? What are they doing? What's the function of oxygen? Yep. Yep, exactly. So it's the final electron acceptor for the production of ATP. So it's basically fueling the energetic needs of the cell. So I really want you to connect how the energy demands of the cell relies on oxygen. What about carbon dioxide? Where's carbon dioxide coming from? Yeah, it's one of our main byproducts of cellular respiration. So again, we're connecting the energetic needs of the cell, both in and out, to these two byproducts, oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now let's talk about reactive hyperemia. This is a little bit different in terms of the cause, but the mechanism is the exact same. So again, we're increasing blood flow in response to some type of previous injury, some type of previous decrease in the blood flow to the area. So there can be a blockage or an injury to some type of tissue, which increases the metabolic demands, or we can have vasodilation that was brought about through some pathology. And when that blockage is released, we then increase the flow to the area, which is going to help remove those metabolites and bring in fresh oxygen. So the reaction is the exact same. We get the exact same response for active hyperemia as we do for reactive hyperemia, but the cause is different. So in active hyperemia, this was due to the body's metabolic demands normally, whereas in reactive hyperemia, there was some type of disruption. So either some type of pathology, injury to a blood vessel, or something that disrupted homeostasis. Okay, so let's go through this flow chart, which kind of distinguishes active from reactive hyperemia. So we start out with an increased metabolic rate. In active hyperemia, this is just a normal increase in metabolic rate. In reactive hyperemia, there's some sort of obstruction to flow. So we decrease flow to start. And then we increase our oxygen consumption and increase carbon dioxide consumption. That is going to generate a reactive increase in the amount of oxygen that's in the area, decreasing the oxygen that's in the area and increasing the carbon dioxide that's in the area, right? If we're decreasing flow, we're gonna have lots of carbon dioxide lingering around and not enough oxygen coming to the tissue. That will then stimulate local arterioles to vasodilate. So we have increased vasodilation in both of these processes, which leads to decreased resistance in both of these processes, right? Remember that decreasing the resistance is doing what to the radius of the arteriole? Increasing the radius. So we're decreasing the resistance, we're increasing the radius, okay? And that will bring about more blood coming into the area, which will correct that original dysfunction, that will increase oxygen delivery, increase carbon dioxide removal, and then we get back to steady state. Okay. Now, once we've corrected the oxygen concentration and carbon dioxide concentration, we must turn this back off. So the negative feedback of this is basically bringing the vessel back to its original state, which is just that typical tone. Okay, so we're no longer vasodilating at that point. All right, so what questions do we have about that? What questions do we have about that bit so far? So we talked about arterioles, we talked about regulating the radius, right? We talked about the three things that regulate the radius: the tone, vasoconstriction, and vasodilation. And then we talked about the intrinsic control of flow. All right, so no questions so far. I hope that means everything is super clear. Okay. Now, another mechanism of regulating flow in terms of a local regulation is the myogenic response. Now, the myogenic response basically says that if you increase flow into the area, you're going to stretch on the blood vessels. And when the blood vessels stretch, they will reactively recoil on themselves. We see a very similar thing in the heart when we talk about Starling's forces of the heart. So stretch of the walls of the arteriole, which happens by increasing the blood flow, causes a reactive recoil of that wall, which causes vasoconstriction. So basically, vasodilation causes vasoconstriction. So if I stretch the wall, it's going to recoil on itself, okay? And what happens is, let's say you increase the perfusion to the area, you bring more blood flow in, you stretch that smooth muscle. Now, the inherent properties in the smooth muscle is going to recoil, which keeps the blood flow constant. So if I stretch the arteriolar wall, it will naturally recoil or vasoconstrict, which keeps the flow constant. Because you don't want to increase the flow to an organ system excessively. And this is the blood vessel's way of sort of protecting itself from excess flow or from excess vasodilation. Okay, I hope that makes sense. All right, any questions on that bit? Okay, let's keep going. So this flow chart will kind of walk us through an example of that. So I increase perfusion pressure. That increases flow to the arteriole. The arteriole smooth muscle will stretch to accept that flow. And then the arteriole smooth muscle will constrict on itself as a reaction to that excess flow. And that will help to increase the resistance, right? And that will decrease the flow. So the reaction to excess flow is to decrease the flow. I hope that makes sense. It's kind of counterintuitive, but it's the way for the vessel to protect itself from excess flow. Because if you flood the system with excess blood, the vessels need to be able to protect themselves from being overexpanded or over vasodilated. Okay, so basically vasodilation results in vasoconstriction. Okay, now when we speak about the cardiac output, let's look at the exercise state in the body. So during exercise, we don't have an increase in blood. I talked about this before. We cannot just magically make blood out of nothing. What we do is shunt blood from one area to the other. So we can dilate vessels to the skeletal muscles and to the heart to increase flow to those organ systems. And that will likely constrict vessels that are going to your GI organs in order to shunt that blood from your GI to your skeletal muscles and heart. And again, this makes sense. And this ties back to what we talked about with the autonomic nervous system. So if you're in a fight or flight state and you're running, you want all of your oxygen to sort of be focused on the important tissues we talked about: skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. And if you are not eating, then it's kind of inefficient to be sustaining flow to your GI organs, particularly if you need that energy, if you need that flow to sort of escape a threat. So there's a disproportionate flow that's diverted to your muscles in the state of exercise and in the state of fight or flight. What, before I jump back here, what system or what organ in the body do you think is kind of exempt from this rule? Which organ or system do you think is kind of exempt from this general rule? The brain. Why the brain? Yeah, your brain always needs blood, okay? So there isn't a time, even when you're sleeping, there is not a time where you can kind of shunt blood away from the brain and kind of ignore it, okay? That doesn't happen. When we're sleeping, we can shunt blood to different areas, like the hypothalamus, to create memories and things like that, but we never want to shunt blood away from the brain. The brain is kind of spoiled in that way where it always needs its blood, it always needs its cardiac output, right? And it can never sort of do with less. Okay, so looking at this pie chart, we can see in our resting state, the distribution of blood flow to our relevant organ systems, skeletal muscle, the kidneys, the GI, and the brain getting a significant chunk. And then during exercise or a fight or flight state, or even if you're stressed, right? If you're stressed about something, then you sort of divert to this response because that's your fight or flight as you flood your system with epinephrine. And so you get more blood going to your skeletal muscle. That's why you kind of get tense if you're nervous about something, and away from your GI organs and things like that.